Welcome to Have a Life Teaching, the podcast designed for educators who are dedicated to enhancing their teaching practice and creating a positive impact on their students' lives. In each episode, we'll dive deep into the world of education, exploring a wide range of topics related to curriculum, instruction, and assessment in K-12 schools. Together, we'll learn from the brightest minds in the education field. So if you're a passionate educator who's ready to take your teaching practice to the next level, join us as we explore the exciting world of education. My name is John Shimbari, signing in and saying, let's have a life teaching. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Have a Life Teaching podcast, where whether you're a teacher, a school administrator, or someone supporting teachers and leaders in schools, we hope you get some great tips out of this podcast episode on how to help our students grow and achieve academically, social, emotionally, just how to help our students become better overall citizens in this world. So with that in mind, really excited about today's topic. And before we get into it, let me just tell a very quick story that's related to it. So as a coach, I'm often going into schools and observing what teachers are putting on the board in terms of learning objectives. And some of you might have student will be able to, others might have learner will be able to, or we will be able to. Doesn't really matter. It's all still about organizing our thinking in terms of what we're going to do for the day. And I've seen some great opportunities for ramping up the learning. So let me explain what I mean by that. So while I'm really excited that many educators are posting their learning objectives on the board, because it really is about not just the teacher, it's about the students knowing what they're doing. So that's the part that really excites me. I think there is an opportunity, though, to increase the level of rigor often in what we're asking students to do. So a very quick example. When I go into classrooms, I might see teachers teaching students what are the causes of the American Revolution, or what are the causes of the American Civil War, or what were the causes of World War I, because our guest is international today. So we'll talk about that. And that's fine. But then are we having students even thinking about, well, which of those causes were probably more impactful than others? Why do you feel that way as a student? What evidence backs that up? So often that's the missing piece, that critical thinking piece. Also, the other piece that's sometimes missing is how to take this knowledge that we're giving our kids and having them create something new from it. So if we are teaching World War I, are students engaging, maybe taking on the role of one of the characters of World War I and creating a skit around that, or an interview where somebody is interviewing this historical figure? So there are so many ways to actually bring creativity into learning as well. But again, we often are stopping at that depth of knowledge level 1 or 2. So this is why I'm really excited to have my next guest join us. My next guest is Alice Vigors. She's an assistant principal in Australia and the author of the wonderful new book, The Thinking Classroom, Supporting Educators to Embed Critical and Creative Thinking. So we're going to be really delving into this today. So Alice, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me, John.
So Alice, one thing I like to ask all my guests when they first come on the show is just tell us a little bit more about your journey into education, and how did critical thinking and creative thinking become your area of interest within education?
Yeah, I have been teaching for 15 years now in Australia, in the state of New South Wales. As you said, I'm an assistant principal, and I have been for the last 4 or 5 years. I kind of chose teaching by accident, for want of a better word. It wasn't kind of my first choice when I left high school, and it was one of those things where I was like, I don't really know what I want to do at 17 with the rest of my life. And I wanted to do meteorology, actually.
Interesting.
Was my first choice, but kind of fell into teaching and was in a school doing a prac within the first 6 months and fell in love with it. And I've been in schools ever since, which is really exciting.
I love
But
that. And you're going to have to explain then to me some more questions I have about our crazy weather that we've been having up here. But in the meantime, that's for another day. So Alice, why then critical thinking? Because congratulations, by the way, on the new book.
no, thank you.
That's a big achievement. Why this topic? Why did you write and dedicate, I'm sure, more than several years of your life writing this book on critical and creative thinking? Why is this important?
Yeah. So it was probably about 2015 when I was introduced to the work of the amazing Ron Richart and Mark Church and their Making Thinking Visible work that they were doing. And in my context at the time, I was in charge of leading kind of that approach across the school and looking at how do we create a culture of thinking in our school? How do we embed critical and creative thinking skills in all of our classrooms from kindergarten to year 6 to support the thinking development of our students? And so that kind of really kick-started that fire or that passion around this kind of area. And it was 2021 when I was approached by my publisher, who had been stumbled across my blog and had been reading the things that I was kind of writing about, just random ramblings in my head that I thought, I'm just going to get it out there. And if someone reads it, that's a bonus. She happened to read it and approached me about writing a book. And so I started writing in January of 2021, and it was published in October. No, 2022. Published October 2022. I don't even know what year it is. Yeah, so it kind of took me, so I started writing January 2022, and published October 2022. But
Wow,
I've had a lot of...
By the way, Alice, you're going to have to tell me how you did that.
It was a super quick turnaround, and everyone kind of thinks I was mad because I'd only not long, my little one, my third child, she was only about 4 months old when I started writing the book. So writing with a newborn is a very different experience, but I had the time.
But there you go.
But I had a lot of the content already with my website and with the blog, and it was kind of just a matter of pulling that all together and all of the other things that I had kind of been thinking about in this space, and it turned into the book that is now published.
Love it, love it. So in a way, the fact that you were home on maternity leave is everyone's gain, because now we have this amazing book.
Yes.
So speaking about this book and speaking about creative and critical thinking, how would you, because I read parts of the book, so I have an understanding of your organization of the book, and I think the organization is very clear. But can you take our listeners through how you organized the book and why you focused on those sections?
Yeah. So the book is kind of divided into 5 parts. The first part is kind of a bit of a theory, that kind of basics that you kind of need to know around critical and creative thinking and why it's important in the classroom. And it kind of breaks down the difference between the two and how they're interrelated. The second part of the book, we kind of dive into a little bit of understanding around the strategies that we might employ, and the key pedagogical practice that we need in classrooms in order to make this work effective. So you're looking at things like the use of thinking routines, the art of questioning. You're looking at visible learning practices. You're looking at the use of explicit instruction components. And then the back half of the book is the part that I really had fun putting together, and it's your more practical part of the book, and it's the part that educators that pick this up, that's where all the gold is hidden. So you're looking at part 3 is kind of around all of the different tools and strategies and thinking routines that you can use to bring this to life. So you're looking at sharing of examples around things that you could do in your literacy classrooms, the English classroom, things in mathematics, things in other curriculum areas, things like your See, Think, Wonder, thinking routines, think, puzzle, explore thinking routines, looking at what are those thinking routines, what are the basic kind of elements, and that draws heavily on the work of Dr. Ron Richard, and then springboarding off that into what does it look like in practice. So sharing lots of practical examples from my own classroom, my own teaching, the students that I've had around how have I adapted those, how have I implemented those in the classroom to bring this work to life, and what does that look like. So there's lots of pictorial examples of what that looks like in the classroom. Part 4 is around the assessment of thinking, and how do we do that? What are the kind of strategies that we can employ in that space? So dive into looking at, what are the different types of assessment. We look at the phases of learning, so your surface, deep, and transfer components of learning. We also look at the solo model and how we can draw upon that to really understand where student thinking is and where to take them next. And the last part is for leaders. How do I lead this with a group of teachers that I'm working with to make this effective and bring it to life? In a nutshell, that's the book.
And that's why it's 300 pages, because there's a lot to unpack there.
There is.
But it's all important, and it's all part of the process, because, and we're going to talk about this now, you hit on some of those things that I think are the pushbacks again, or is the pushback against critical and creative thinking. How do I know if the kids are doing it, and I don't know what to do, and how do I actually train myself to teach kids to be doing this? So I think there's a lot of really good things to unpack there. So with that in mind, Alice, you started by saying why critical and creative thinking, right? Yeah. And that really is the first part of your book. So very quickly, why critical thinking? Why creative thinking?
I think it's important that we develop those skills with our learners. It's really the basis of everything that we do in the classroom. And it's really important as educators that we have an understanding of what they are and how we develop those in the classroom. So a really simplified explanation of it is that your creative thinking is the thinking that we do when we're generating ideas. So that's all of those, identifying and being able to list and name things, all of those kinds of, brainstorming, those kinds of skills. And critical thinking is the thinking that we do when we're judging and we're evaluating ideas. So we're looking at, evaluative thinking, and we're looking at things like what is the cause and effect between different kinds of things. And you mentioned it before, John, when in your intro, when you're looking at comparing different concepts and why is one more effective than the other, all of those different kinds of thinking, and they work kind of hand in hand to support each other, even though they are kind of separate ways of thinking about things. And I think it's really important for educators to have that awareness of the types of thinking that we're asking our students to do, and really unpack what that means for our kids. So when we're asking kids to identify something, what does that mean? What does that look like? How do I model that for the students in my class so that they know when they see the word identify, when I say the word identify, they know exactly the type of thinking they have to do in order to be able to do that effectively. So it's, really equipping educators, but also our students with that understanding around, here's the type of thinking I'm doing. Here's what it looks like, what it sounds like, what it feels like, and here's how I put it into practice. So, a really big part of that, as I just mentioned, is being able to model that and using Think Alouds in the classroom to show kids how to do this kind of thinking. Because lots of our thinking is silent and occurs in our heads, most of the time, unless, we're engaging in a conversation and we're sharing that thinking. So, being able to make it visible is a really important part of this work.
And we're definitely going to talk about that next, Alice. What resonates with me with what you were saying is, yes, in your book, you talk about making thinking visible and making thinking or critically thinking in our classrooms and building in that creative thinking in our classrooms. And you talk specifically around literacy and numeracy. But just hearing you explain all the things and the ways in which you train students to think critically, I was here sitting thinking, these are life skills, because even if, the student, although we don't want them to forget their content knowledge either, but let's say they don't remember the specifics of the lesson you taught in science today, 15 years, they will hopefully remember how to think through a process, how to compare and contrast, how to think through cause and effect. And those are skills that they're going to need in almost any subject or any career path that they take. Because you and I, Alice, we don't know, obviously what careers our students are going to gravitate towards, number one. And number two, we don't know even what those careers are going to look like in another 15, 20 years, given how fast technology is multiplying. And just look at AI. That's going to affect all of our lives in ways that we have yet to even know. So, we might not know what content skills specifically kids will need in the future, but I think you're really highlighting, how and why we need to help kids think about thinking, making that metacognitive visualization, because you mentioned the word, making thinking visible. And you're right, because if a teacher puts on the board, students will think about the causes of blah, blah, blah. Well, I can't measure that. I can't assess that. I don't know what's going on in their brain. But if we could have those discussions, those collaborative discussions, if we could be using some of those protocols you mentioned, like See, Think, Wonder, or the other ones I saw in your book, which I loved, Main Side Hidden or Step Inside, students are articulating their thinking. And that we can be assessing and figuring out what the next steps are in how we're teaching our kids based on the quality of that discussion that they're having. Now, how do you see making critical and creative thinking visual? What are some of the ways you would recommend for a teacher, especially a teacher new to this? How could they make it visible?
Yeah, I think, you mentioned it before around using things like learning intentions and success criteria is one of the ways that we can make thinking visible. And that's kind of, I guess, the start around a teacher unpacking what it is that you're learning about or learning to do. And your success criteria is the types of thinking you're going to need to employ to be able to achieve that learning goal. So, if you're looking at, reflecting on writing or whatever the purpose of the lesson might be, the intended learning, you're looking at, okay, what are the things that my students are going to need to do to be able to reflect on a piece of writing and to make sure that it's effective. So, I want them to be able to identify particular components in their work. Can they identify the evidence of this particular element in their work? So you're going to be looking at unpacking how do I teach my kids to identify those things? What are the strategies I'm going to employ to be able to do that? And looking at unpacking first that way. Another really easy way is to use thinking routines. And there's lots out there that you can access, lots in different locations. And these are all kind of been compiled from the research of Dr. Ron Richard and the educators that he's been working with over quite a number of years. There's lots of really effective ones that you can use, and the one that I often tell particularly teachers new to this space to start with is a See, Think, Wonder. It's a really easy routine to kind of dive into, and it's one of those versatile ones you can use across the curriculum. So you've got the title of the thinking routine are the prompts kind of that you're using. So you're seeing, what is it that you see, observe, or notice? And it could be, a visual prompt. It could be a text that you're unpacking, could be a short animation, whatever your kind of provocation or your stimulus might be, really pulling apart all of the things that you're noticing about that stimulus. And that's where you're drawing on those identifying skills. Can you kind of identify all of the components, the elements of that provocation? And then looking at that thinking prompt is, what do you think? And you can adapt it and tailor it to whatever it is that you're wanting the kids to think about with the particular stimulus. Why do you think this occurred? Blah, blah, blah. And really kind of diving down deeper now that you've uncovered all of the things that you notice. So it kind of takes away the kind of brain's ability to go, look, I'm wanting to think about this, but I noticed that, and I've just spotted this, kind of that child is going, shiny things. I've noticed that, this. And it kind of, you do that first, you take away that layer, and then you dive that little bit deeper. And then looking at unpacking, what are the things that you wonder about this stimulus? What are you wondering about the topic that's attached to this stimulus? And using that as a springboard into further learning and that further exploration of student thinking, those student wonderings. So that's a really easy one to use in literacy. I use it all the time in numeracy and mathematics classroom. I use it across other key learning areas, so the humanities, your sciences. You can use it anywhere. And it's one of those things where, the more that you use it, the more that it becomes familiar and becomes routine for your students, for you, and the more comfortable they feel using it. And they'll eventually get to the point where they use it without even realizing that they're using it. So it's kind of that development of thinking, the phases of thinking development, where in the beginning it's clunky and it feels unnatural. And you kind of chunk each of the sections and you walk the kids through each of the sections. So you kind of show them what it looks like, you help them unpack it. And then the more that you use it, the easier it feels. And the kids kind of go, I know what to do here. Yep, and it's still kind of that chunked, but they're starting to become a little bit more fluid until you can use it across your curriculum, use it in any situation, and you use it almost without realizing it. And oftentimes the kids will, when you get to that point, you'll be doing something and you notice the kids using that routine independently. And it's kind of one of those things like, often the kids will say, you just used to see, think, wonder. And the kid will go, oh yeah, I did too. It's that really nice moment of that strategy and that tool to unpack thinking that they can use without you going, right, here's what we're going to do to unpack this.
Yeah, so much there too to unpack. When you were speaking, Alice, just to your point, even when you were just talking about the students saying, hey, you're using this same strategy. I have a very similar strategy to see, think, wonder when I coach adults around looking at their school data and determining what are our next steps based on what the scholarship data is saying. So even not only using these protocols with our students to make their thinking visible, but how are we using these protocols to make our collaborative thinking visible, particularly when it comes to school improvement and growth, right? So I just wanted to make that connection because, this is a great opportunity for not only to teach our students how to do it, but how to model critical thinking as adults as well, right? So
absolutely. Yes. And I think that's a really good point, John, in that these routines are not ones that are just student-centered. You can use them, from your preschoolers all the way up to adults in higher education and working with your leadership teams, all those kinds of things. They are applicable to any age.
Exactly. Now, I'm going to throw a hard question at you. I don't think it's going to be hard. I think you're going to have the answer. But I'm going to throw a question out to you that I sometimes get as a consultant. I'm sure you've heard something similar. It's, yeah, this critical thinking thing is really good, but I have students that still aren't mastering their grade level standards. So, I have to do a depth of knowledge level question 1 because my kids really just are, they're at the identification level. They can't analyze. They're just not there. They haven't met, they're like 3 grade levels below. I know what I would say to those folks or how to help those folks. What would you say to those folks?
That is a really good question. I think, and you see, classrooms are full of students who sit at varying stages of learning, and it is a question that you kind of get often, particularly when you've got kids who aren't quite where you would expect them to be in their learning journey, but it doesn't mean that they can't think and act and critically and creatively. It's around, I think, providing them with tools and scaffolds in which to help them get to where you want them to go. So it's no different to when you're teaching kids to read or you're working numerically with kids in the mathematics classroom. You provide them with scaffolds in order to help them understand a concept and help move that thinking and that understanding forward. We do the same when we're developing the critical and creative thinking skills of our students. You provide them with a scaffold, you help mold and model that process and use that gradual release of responsibility till they're able to get to that level of thinking that you're wanting them to get to, that ability to analyze. And those students are more than capable of doing that. We just need to put the right structures in place to help them get there.
And this is why I like you, Alice, because you answered exactly the way I wanted you to answer. I'm glad we're on the same thinking. We're actually thinking the same thing. So see, we're making our critical thinking visible.
Yeah.
That's the key. The scaffold piece is what I even tell folks. I say, well, if your students aren't going, not all your students, you still want your students who are meeting grade level standards or a little bit above to still be creatively coming up with those questions on their own. But maybe for the students who are a little bit below proficiency, you provide some of the guiding questions to get their thinking going. Or maybe we number the lines on the text and say, all right, you could probably find information out about this between lines 5 and 10. I'm a big fan of annotation strategy, really making sure that we're really marking up what we're reading and breaking up the different parts of what we're reading. So to your point, Alice, I think every student has the ability to do this, even if they're not meeting the content level standard. It's about helping bring in these scaffolds for students, the ones that need it, not the ones that don't, because you don't want to give the ones that don't need it a crutch, because as kids, they're gonna take the crutch, right? We want to push those kids. But to your point before, I think you were also talking about the different groups of kids you have. So maybe you as the teacher sit down with the students who need those scaffolds. And to your point about modeling the practices and the processes, maybe you're spending more time doing that directly with those students, whereas your other students are doing that more independently.
Yeah. And it's about, providing those, when we do it, when we're differentiating, it's just good practice around, you've got your core group of students, but you've got those extending prompts that you're going to push the thinking of the kids who are capable of, extending beyond that core level of instruction that you're focusing on. You want to push them that little bit further. And then you're enabling prompts with those kids who aren't quite there yet, that you're going to bring them along the way. You're going to provide that scaffold and support to help them get to, or get, as close as you can to where the core level of instruction is pitched at.
Definitely. And for our listeners, Alice is way too modest, because in her book, she has a plethora of strategies for making thinking critical or having students doing critical thinking and thinking creatively. A ton of strategies in there. So even if you don't know anything about the theory as to the why, just do those strategies and you'll be golden.
Yeah.
To her point before about educators flipping to the back of the book to look at those strategies. But I'm so glad that we did talk about the reason why this is necessary, because you need to really help our kids think about their thinking, because we don't know what the future holds in terms of careers, jobs, or the skills that really will be necessary content-wise. But good thinking is good thinking. But again, to Alice, your point, we have to help our students know how to communicate their thinking, make that thinking visible, right?
Yeah. And they're not skills that are ever going to be, out of fashion or, not needed. They're going to always be needed as whatever job that kind of arises into the future. And so it's really important that even though they're, and I hate that they term them soft skills, because they're really not. They're like the core skills that sit under everything that we do. But I think it's really important, and there is a chapter in the book that kind of helps teachers unpack this around how do I plan for this? And planning for it is really important. It's not one of those things where, I guess you can go in and wing it, but it's more impactful when you sit and think about, how am I going to scaffold the thinking of my students in this particular learning experience? What are the things, what are those guiding questions, those prompts that I'm going to use to help scaffold and draw out the thinking, where I want my students to get to in their thinking? And how do I support them if they're not quite there? So making sure that we're intentional in planning so that we're not walking in blind going, oh, this kid's just throwing me this curveball. I wasn't expecting it because I haven't thought about all of the things that the kids might bring to the table when we're engaging in this experience. And so I don't know where to take them from here. So having that, and, teachers do that when they're planning lessons anyway, they're thinking about those kinds of things. So it's being intentional about what are the routines and scaffolds I'm going to put in place to help them unpack their thinking in this particular way. How do I break those processes down for them to help them get to this depth of knowledge that we're looking for? Kind of embed that into the culture and the fabric of the way things are done in your context.
So, Alice, thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it. I think this was a great conversation. I know this was a great conversation that is going to really benefit our educators listening today about how to really, step up the learning opportunities for their students.
Yeah. Thanks for having me, John. I really enjoyed the conversation, and I hope your listeners find it valuable.
They will. And like I said, take a look at her book, because Alice really offers a lot of great strategies. Thank you again, Alice.
Oh, thanks, John.
Thank you for listening today. I hope you got some great tips that you can bring back into your teaching. Remember, have a life teaching without sacrificing your own. Also, don't forget to subscribe and be well.